Good morning, Pelham Road. Happy Friday to you. Hope you got some plans this weekend to have a good time. Well, I want to start a new tradition and follow it next week with Storytime Friday. All right, so every Friday, I'm going to try to have you a story. Okay, so listen up to this week's. Years ago, churches tried to update the revival. The revival was this idea of having a week-long service, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, Friday night. They did it for many, many years. I know it sounds archaic now, but it was a way of sort of refreshing the church. Well, in the 80s, people grew tired of that. And they came up with a clever way to bring folks back for one more hour of preaching. It was updating the revival. These extra services were called Marvelous Mondays or Fabulous Fridays or Taco Thursdays. That's not right. I'm not right. I shouldn't have done that. I'm sorry. I couldn't resist. Well, I was invited from time to time to participate in these services. And what you would have is 5 marvelous Mondays in May. And so every Monday there would be a special service. It'd be special music and a revival type of atmosphere and an invited preacher and so forth. So every now and then I'd get invited to go and do one of these. Now, I'm one of those preachers who doesn't like to preach to the choir. I like to bring a discomforting word. So I would look the church up. Of course, in these days there was no internet, but I could do my own research. I could look up things and evaluate a situation. And if it was a church that looked like what I called a country club sort of church out in the suburbs, I'd bring them a message that they needed to welcome the other, that they needed to get out of their comfort zone, open up their arms, and love all kinds of people, because I assumed that since they were a country club type church, they had strict standards for admission. But if I looked the church up and it looked like it was in a changing neighborhood, struggling a bit, losing members, I'd bring them a message of hope. And so you get my point. I tried to bring the spiritual food they needed, not the platitudes they wanted. Once I was invited to a church near Mobile, Alabama, for a marvelous Monday. Now, from what I could tell in my research, it was a thriving suburb. Strong schools, new construction going on. And so I decided to bring them one of my sermons from Acts 9 or Acts 10 about how no one is unclean. And that God has not made anyone unclean, and the church has to reach out to those that are struggling, the broken people, the people that are different. So I arrived about 30 minutes before the service. I spoke with the pastor for a bit, and then I began to meet the people as they arrived. I've always liked to do that. This was not the crowd I was expecting. There were Hispanic children running around the building. I looked up in the choir loft, and there were these 3 African-American women preparing, getting their solo ready. And then there were white folks wandering around and doing the ushering and the greeting. I mean, this was not the crowd I was looking for. And you could tell these people already had their arms open. They were already welcoming everybody. You could feel it. I mean, they had a building that was probably built for about 100 folks, and they crammed about 150 folks in there. So quickly, I changed my sermon. I'm flexible like that. And it turned out to be a really nice night. You mixed the gospel choir in with the special music, which I think was from a brass quartet of all things. And it turned out to be a rather remarkable evening, or maybe I should say a marvelous Monday. When it was all over, I spoke with the pastor. I said, tell me about this place. How did you do this? How did this happen? And this is what he said. I grew up in this church, and it was a little mill village in those days. I lived a couple streets over. After I felt the call to preach when I was an adult man, I sat over there underneath the second window. One Sunday, the preacher resigned. And a group of folks came to me and asked me if I'd preach for a while. There were about 30, 35 folks coming. And that was 12 years ago. I preached a sermon. I preached Peter's sermon right out of the book of Acts. You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or to visit with a Gentile, but God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. God said it, he said. No one is unclean. No one is therefore untouchable by the church. I told them if our doors weren't open for all variety of God's creation, then we needed to close up. Well, I asked him, I said, well, how did that approach go over? He said, well, the deacons came to me and told me I needed to be careful, that they paid the bills in this church and that the Hispanic folks couldn't keep this church up. Well, I said, did they fire you? They weren't paying me, he said. I was a volunteer. You can't fire a volunteer preacher. I said, well, was that the end of it? No. They came back to me. They told me I better lighten up on preaching about Jesus loving all people. And I said, red, yellow, black, and white, they are all precious in his sight. I told them if they was that ignorant of Scripture, they didn't need to hold any office in the church. This man was becoming my hero. So I asked him, I said, well, what happened next? He said, well, they left. I preached really hard, and the bills started piling up, and I just kept working over for Federal Express, and I didn't need their money. And finally, I preached us all the way down to 2 people, my mom and my aunt. And from then on, I made sure that anyone who joined this church knew that this gathering wasn't about going to heaven. It wasn't about being Baptist. We are disciples of Jesus. We follow Jesus here, and that isn't easy. And if you do it right, you won't even be respectable, he said. Jesus fed the hungry, loved the stranger, welcomed the unwanted, and sacrificed for all. And then he looked around the parking lot and he said, now, when you preach that, this is what you get. And he pointed. And in the parking lot, you had white folks hugging African Americans. You had some kids out here on the front lawn playing ball. And you had this biker dude that this woman's car had broke down, and he's gotten off his bike and he's crawled under her car trying to fix it, get it to turn over. Apparently, they were still having church. Have a great weekend.